The ledger hit the marshal's desk with a sound like a gunshot, and Belle Aldridge stood on the other side of it with her dark eyes blazing, and her jaw set in a way that told Frank Dawson she was not going to move until he acknowledged what she had put in front of him. "Every dollar," she said, and her voice was low and precise, the kind of voice that had learned long ago not to waste itself on shouting. $4,722. I know where it went, I know who moved it, and I know which man in this county is still breathing while my husband is buried under 3 feet of red dirt on the hill behind our ranch." Frank stared at the ledger. The pages were covered in columns of handwriting so neat and organized it looked like something out of a bank in Denver, not the work of a woman who had ridden 40 miles through dust and heat to drop it on his desk. His badge felt heavy on his chest. The payroll had been stolen 6 days ago, the army was breathing down his neck, and every lead he had chased had turned to smoke in his hands. "Mrs. Aldridge," he started. "Do not call me that," she said. "Not unless you intend to tell me why you have spent 6 days looking in the wrong direction, while the man who orchestrated this theft drank whiskey in the back room of the Silver Spur and laughed about it." The blood drained from Frank's face. He had been in that saloon 2 days ago. He had talked to the barkeep, questioned 3 cowboys, and come away with nothing. "You need to sit down," he said, though he was the one who felt like he needed to sit. "I have been sitting for 3 years, Belle said. "I sat while my husband built a cattle operation from nothing. I sat while he took a loan he could not afford to protect our herd through the drought. I sat while someone convinced him to partner with the wrong man, and then I sat beside his grave after that same wrong man had him killed to keep the secret quiet. I am done sitting, Marshal Dawson. The only question now is whether you are going to help me, or whether I am going to have to finish this myself." The silence between them stretched long enough to hear the wind against the single window of the marshal's office, long enough for Frank to look at the ledger properly, to trace one column with his finger and feel the cold comprehension move through him like water. She had not just traced the money. She had reconstructed an entire conspiracy from receipts, freight manifests, and cattle sale records, and she had done it in 6 days from a ranch 40 miles outside of town. He had been a lawman for 11 years. He had never seen anything like it. 3 weeks earlier, before any of this had happened, Belle Aldridge had been doing what she did every morning since the burial of her husband Thomas, which was sitting at the large oak desk in the study of the Aldridge ranch house and working through the accounts. She was 31 years old and she had been doing the ranch's bookkeeping since she was 24, the year she married Thomas, and in the 7 years of that marriage she had taught herself more about financial record keeping, property law, and land valuation than most lawyers in the territory knew. Thomas had been the face of the operation, the broad-shouldered man who shook hands at cattle sales and argued prices at the stockyards. Belle had been the mind behind it, the one who knew at any given moment exactly how much money was where, what was owed, what was earned, and what the margins looked like heading into the next quarter. When Thomas died of a single bullet through the chest on the road between Harlan and the Aldridge property 18 months ago, the official ruling had been robbery. His horse had been found, his wallet had been taken. The sheriff at the time, an old man named Corbett who drank steadily from noon onward, had written it up as a drifter crime and closed the file within 2 weeks. Belle had not accepted that. She had her reasons, and she kept those reasons in a separate ledger that she stored behind a loose board beneath the desk. The morning that the Army payroll went missing from the Harlan freight office, Belle was in town for supplies. She heard the commotion from the general store, the shouting, the boots on the boardwalk, and she watched through the window as Marshal Frank Dawson organized the first wave of the search with the focused calm of a man who knew his job. She had heard of Dawson before. He had come to Harlan about a year ago, appointed by the territorial office after old Corbett finally drank himself into retirement. People said he was honest. People said he was thorough. People in Harlan said a lot of things that turned out not to be true. She bought her flour and her lamp oil and she went home. She sat at her desk. She opened both ledgers, the official one and the secret one beneath the floor, and she began to think. The payroll theft had not surprised her. What surprised her was the timing, because the timing connected to something she had already been tracking for 3 months. Belle had a gift that was difficult to explain to people who did not share it. Numbers for her were not abstract symbols. They were a language, and that language told stories. When she looked at a column of figures, she could feel when something was wrong the way a musician could hear a note that was slightly off pitch. There was a quality to the pattern of honest transactions that was different from the pattern of dishonest ones, and once she had learned to read that quality, she could not unlearn it. 3 months ago, she had begun to notice something wrong in the freight records that passed through Harlan. She had access to these records because her ranch shipped cattle regularly, and the freight office kept copies of every manifest that she could request for her own accounting purposes. She had been requesting them for years, and nobody thought anything of it, because she was a widow running a cattle operation, and everyone assumed she was just being careful about her shipping costs. What she had actually been doing was building a picture of something much larger than her own operation. Someone was using the Harlan freight system to move money. Not cattle, not goods, not legitimate cargo, but money disguised as cargo, represented in the freight records as various shipments that did not quite match up when you traced them all the way through the chain of custody. The discrepancies were small, and they were clever, the kind of thing that would be invisible to someone looking at any single record in isolation. But Belle was not looking at single records in isolation. She was looking at the whole picture. She had been looking at it for 3 months, and by the time the Army payroll went missing, she already had a name: Harlan Cade. Harlan Cade was the man the town had been named for, or rather the town had been named for his father, the original Cade who had founded it. The son had inherited everything: the freight office, the controlling interest in the Silver Spur Saloon, 2 ranches, and enough political connection to the territorial capital that most people in Harlan treated him with the kind of careful courtesy that was really just a polished version of fear. He was not a violent man himself, not in any way that could be seen or proven. He was the kind of man who had other men for that, the kind of man who attended church and donated to the schoolhouse fund and shook hands with a warm smile, while the machinery of something terrible operated quietly behind his eyes. Belle had suspected him of being involved in Thomas's death for 16 months. She had not said so to anyone because she had no proof, and because she understood, with the cold precision that was one of her gifts, that an accusation without proof against a man like Harlan Cade was not justice. It was just noise that would get her dismissed or, more likely, put her in the same kind of danger that had put Thomas in the ground. So she had worked quietly. She had traced the freight records. She had cross-referenced them against the cattle sale records at the stockyards, against the property records at the county clerk's office, against the bank deposit records that she had legitimate access to through her own account. She had built the picture one small piece at a time, and when the payroll went missing, she had looked at her picture and seen immediately how the theft connected to everything else she had already been tracking. The payroll money had not been stolen for the obvious reason. It had been stolen to fund something, specifically to make up a shortfall in a transaction that Cade needed to complete within a narrow window of time. If Belle was right about the broader pattern, and she was certain she was right, then Cade was in the middle of a much larger operation that required a significant and sudden injection of cash to keep moving. The payroll was a desperate measure, not a sophisticated one. It was the kind of thing a man did when he was running out of time, which meant the money was still local. It had not moved yet, and it would move within days because Cade could not afford to wait. She had worked through the night, confirming everything, checking and rechecking, and then in the blue pre-dawn light of the morning after the theft she had dressed, saddled her horse, ridden 40 miles to Harlan, and walked into Frank Dawson's office. Frank spent the first hour after Belle left his office standing at the window staring at the street below, and trying to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about this investigation. He was not a man who struggled with his pride. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a lawman could be was the kind of man who could not admit when someone else was right. That kind of pride got people killed, sometimes you, sometimes somebody else, and Frank Dawson had spent 11 years carefully excising it from himself the way you dug a splinter from your palm. He was honest about his own limitations. He was honest about his mistakes. What he was having trouble with was the scale of what Belle Aldridge had handed him. She had walked in as an unknown, a widow from 40 miles out, a woman he had never spoken to before that morning, and she had handed him a complete reconstruction of a criminal conspiracy that had been operating under his jurisdiction for at least 2 years. She had done it with accounting records. She had done it in 6 days from a ranch without a telegraph. He picked up the ledger again and looked at it more carefully this time, following the thread of her reasoning from one notation to the next. It was flawless. Every connection was supported. Every number was verified against at least 2 independent sources. There were footnotes in the margins explaining her methodology, and those footnotes were written with the kind of systematic clarity that he associated with judges and military commanders, not frontier widows. He needed to verify it. That was just his nature, and it was not distrust of her specifically but habit, because a marshal who acted on a single source without verification was a marshal who ended up looking foolish at best and complicit at worst. He spent the rest of the morning doing exactly that, pulling the records she had cited and checking them against her conclusions. By noon, he had confirmed 12 of her 14 primary assertions. The other 2 he had not yet been able to check, because they required access to records held at the freight office, which was currently controlled by Harlan Cade. He was standing outside the freight office considering his options when he saw Belle Aldridge come around the corner of the building with a leather satchel over her shoulder, walking with the brisk, unhurried pace of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. He caught up to her in 3 strides. "What are you doing here?" "Collecting the February and March freight manifests," she said without slowing down. "I have a standing order. They hold them for me every month. Nobody thinks anything of it." "You cannot go in there." She stopped then and turned and looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to be doing calculations about him even as she spoke. "You have been standing outside this building for 10 minutes, which tells me you have verified most of what I showed you this morning, and you need the freight office records to confirm the rest, but you are concerned that going in will alert Cade." He stared at her. "I have been picking up my freight manifests from this office for 4 years, she said. "My request is already filed. If I do not collect them today, that is the unusual thing. If you want those records without tipping Cade, then the answer is to let me walk in there and collect what I am already scheduled to collect. And if Cade has someone watching—" "He does," she said. "A man named Kelso sits on the bench outside the hardware store across the street every afternoon. He has been there since this morning, which is not his usual pattern, which tells me Cade has him watching the freight office specifically. So I am going to walk in, collect my manifests, and Kelso is going to see a widow picking up her monthly paperwork, which is exactly what he expects to see." Frank looked across the street. There was a man on the bench outside the hardware store. He had not noticed him before, but now that he looked, he could see the slight angle of the man's posture, the way his eyes moved without his head moving. "How do you know his name?" Frank asked. "I know most people in this county," Belle said quietly. "I have spent 18 months learning everyone connected to Harlan Cade. Now will you let me do this, or would you prefer to stand here until Kelso wonders why the marshal is having such a long conversation with a widow outside the freight office?" Frank stepped back. "I will be at the diner across the street. Come find me when you are done." She nodded once and walked into the freight office. He watched her go with a feeling he could not immediately name. It was somewhere between professional respect and something more complicated, the kind of feeling that surprised you because you had not been expecting to feel anything at all. She was inside for exactly 11 minutes. When she came out, she was carrying the satchel and walking at the same unhurried pace, and she crossed the street and went directly into the diner without looking in his direction. He counted to 60 and followed her. She had taken a table near the back, away from the windows, and she had the satchel open and two manifests already laid side by side on the table when he sat down across from her. The diner's owner, a stout woman named Clara, came by and Frank ordered coffee without thinking about it. "Here," Belle said, turning one of the manifests so he could read it. "This is the February record, and this is the March record. The discrepancy is in the weight listings for the Cade freight cargo on the 14th of each month." Frank leaned in. The numbers were close but not matching in a way that made sense for normal variance. "Someone adjusted the weight after the initial manifest was filed," he said. "After and before," Belle said. "The original entry is in a slightly different ink, which means someone went back and changed it. But they forgot to change the corresponding entry in the delivery log, which is a separate record. The delivery log shows the actual weight. The manifest shows a false weight. The difference in those weights when converted from freight rates represents a cash value that does not appear anywhere in the legitimate billing records." Frank ran the calculation in his head approximately and then looked at her because he wanted to be sure. "How much?" "Over the 14 months I can document approximately $3,200, she said. "And that is only this mechanism. There are at least 3 others." Clara brought the coffee. Belle waited until she left and then continued. "The payroll theft is connected to a land deal," she said. "Cade has been systematically buying land through a series of intermediaries so that the purchases are not connected to him publicly. He needs to complete one final purchase within the next 10 days or the option expires, and he loses everything he has invested in the previous acquisitions. The land in question sits over an aquifer that the Territorial Railroad Survey identified as critical infrastructure for the planned line extension. If he controls that land, he controls the water, and anyone who needs water for the railroad construction is going to pay him for it." Frank sat back in his chair. He let the full shape of it settle into his mind. "That is why your husband was killed," he said. Belle's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thomas owned a parcel that sits between 2 of the pieces Cade has already acquired. Without it, the land corridor is broken. Thomas refused to sell, twice." She paused. "And then he was dead, and because I inherited the property and I am a woman, Cade assumed the next approach would be easier. He approached you 3 times. He was very polite about it." Her voice was perfectly level. "I told him I needed time to consider. What I actually needed was time to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I have been using that time productively." Frank watched her face. There was grief there, deep and controlled, the kind of grief that had been compressed over many months into something that functioned more like fuel. He recognized it because he had carried something like it himself once, a long time ago in a different territory, and he knew how dangerous it could be to a person if they let it become the only thing driving them. "Mrs. Aldridge," he started. "Belle," she said. The correction was small, but it moved something in him. "Belle. I need to ask you something, and I need a direct answer." She met his eyes. "How much of what you are doing right now is about the payroll, and how much of it is about your husband?" The silence that followed was not evasive. She appeared to be considering the question honestly. "It is about justice," she said finally. "The payroll matters because $4,700 is a year's wages for the soldiers it was meant for, and they did not deserve to lose it. My husband matters because he was a good man who was murdered to protect a fraud, and he did not deserve that either. And the fraud matters because if Cade succeeds in this land scheme, he will own a resource that an entire railroad and all the communities along it will depend on. And he will use that ownership in the way he uses everything, for control and extraction. So the answer to your question is that everything is about justice, and justice requires all of it to be resolved." Frank drank his coffee and thought about what he was going to do next, and thought, not for the first time since she had walked into his office, that he had never in his 11 years of law enforcement met anyone quite like her. Over the next 4 days they worked together, though calling it a partnership would have been a generous description of what it actually was. Belle had the information and Frank had the legal authority, and what that meant in practice was that Belle was usually 3 steps ahead, and Frank was usually catching up. She was not condescending about it. He gave her credit for that. She shared what she knew when he asked, and she explained her reasoning when he needed it explained, and she never made him feel stupid for not having seen what she had seen, even when it was clear that she could not quite understand how he had missed it. She was just precise. She communicated in facts and logic, and when emotion entered into it, she seemed to be aware of it and kept it separate from the analytical work. He found it fascinating. He found her fascinating. He tried not to think about that too much because they were in the middle of something that required clear heads. On the first day, they confirmed the identity of the men Cade had used to actually take the payroll. 2 brothers named Hatch from a ranch east of town who did irregular work for Cade and had a documented history of petty crime. Frank brought them in on the second day while Belle waited at the diner with her ledger open in front of her, and he had the feeling as he left that she would have handled the Hatch brothers herself if he had been unavailable, though he was glad she had not because the older one, Dale Hatch, had a temper and a willingness to use it. The money was not with the Hatch brothers. They had moved it, which was what Belle had predicted, to a location she had also predicted, a storage building on the eastern edge of the Cade freight yard. Frank verified this on the second day while Belle, with the infuriating calm of someone who had already known the answer, made a note in her ledger. The problem is that the money is there but Cade himself is not connected to it directly, Frank said that evening. They were at a table in the diner again, which had become their informal working space. Clara, who appeared to have accepted this arrangement without requiring an explanation, kept the coffee coming and pretended not to hear anything. The Hatch brothers will say they moved it for a man named Garrett, who is Cade's primary intermediary, and Garrett will say he was acting on someone else's instructions, and by the time you trace it back the connection to Cade will be 3 or 4 steps removed. I know, Belle said. That is why the freight records are more important than the money itself. The freight records establish the pattern of behavior. The money is one instance. The records are the architecture of the whole thing, and the architecture goes back far enough to include the period just before Thomas was killed. Frank looked at her. Can you establish that in a way a court will accept? Yes, she said without hesitation. But I need one more thing. I need the original land survey records showing Cade's intermediary purchases, because I have the freight records showing money moving through his system, and I have the bank records showing deposits into accounts held by those intermediaries. But I need the property records to complete the chain from the money to the land purchases. That connects the financial fraud to the motive for Thomas's murder. The property records are at the county clerk's office in Millhaven, Frank said. Millhaven was the county seat, 20 miles east of Harlan. I know where they are. I have been thinking about how to get copies of them without alerting Cade. He has connections at the clerk's office. I am fairly certain his cousin works there. Her name is Dora Cade, Frank said. Yes, she is the deputy clerk, which means if I request those records through normal channels, she will know about it within the hour. Frank thought for a moment. I can request them under seal, a marshal's investigation inquiry. Dora would not have authorization to open a sealed request. Belle looked at him. For the first time, something shifted in her expression that was not entirely professional. It was brief and she controlled it quickly, but he caught it. You can do that. I can, he said, and I should have done it 3 days ago, so do not thank me for it. She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was something in that direction, and it did something to the inside of his chest that he was not prepared for. They sent the request to Millhaven that evening by telegram. Frank spent the 3rd day interviewing additional witnesses and collecting statements, and Belle spent it at the ranch organizing her documentation, into a formal presentation that could be submitted as evidence. On the fourth evening, she brought it back to town, and they spent 3 hours at the diner going through it together, and Frank found himself looking at her hands as she pointed to entries in the ledger. The ink stain on her right index finger, the small scar on the back of her left wrist from what looked like a wire fence, the sureness of every gesture. He told himself to stop. On the morning of the 5th day, the sealed response arrived from Millhaven, and it was better than they had hoped, because the property records showed not only the intermediary purchases Belle had identified but 2 additional ones she had not known about, which expanded the scale of the land scheme considerably and added to the strength of the case. Frank had Harlan Cade arrested that afternoon. He did it himself with 2 deputies he trusted at the Silver Spur where Cade took his noon whiskey. Cade was polite about it in the way that powerful men are sometimes polite in public, when they are confident the situation will resolve in their favor. He looked at Frank with the patient eyes of a man who believed he owned enough of the territory to make any arrest temporary. "This is a misunderstanding," Cade said, as the deputies took his arms. "I am certain we can resolve this with a conversation." "You will have plenty of time for conversations," Frank said. "The territorial prosecutor will be in Harlan in 3 days. You can start the conversation with him." He held Cade's gaze for a moment and watched the man recalculate, looking for the angle, the leverage, the way out that men like him always believed existed. Frank let him look, because there was not one. He had made certain of that before he walked through the door. It was Belle who had shown him how to make certain of it, though he did not say that to Cade. The 2 weeks following the arrest were complicated and busy in the way that legal proceedings in frontier territories always were, which was to say chaotic and slow, and punctuated by moments of genuine alarm. Cade's lawyer arrived from the territorial capital within 4 days and was sharp and expensive, and made several motions that temporarily gave Frank cause for concern. The territorial prosecutor, a steady-eyed man named Aldous Pierce, had reviewed Belle's documentation before his arrival and told Frank privately that it was the most thorough evidentiary package he had received from a non-attorney source in 20 years of practice, and that whoever had assembled it should have been a lawyer. Belle was called to testify before the territorial court representative who came to Harlan to take depositions. She testified for 6 hours, and Frank, who had been present for all of it, watched the court representative's initial skepticism dissolve within the first 30 minutes as she walked methodically through the freight records and the financial analysis with a precision and a completeness that left no room for the kind of confusion that a defense attorney could exploit. She was not theatrical about it. She did not perform. She simply explained what the numbers said and why they said it and what that meant, and the numbers were irrefutable. Garrett, Cade's primary intermediary, took a plea arrangement and testified against Cade in exchange for reduced charges. The Hatch brothers, facing serious time, provided corroborating evidence about the payroll theft. The combined weight of it was enough. Harlan Cade was charged with fraud, theft of federal property, conspiracy, and based on the testimony of Garrett, who had been present for the conversation in which the order had been given, the murder of Thomas Aldridge. The payroll was recovered completely intact from the freight storage building. All $4,722 of it was returned to the Army. Frank stood outside the marshal's office on the evening after the formal charges were filed and looked at the main street of Harlan and felt the particular quiet that came after something had been resolved, the kind of quiet that was not peaceful exactly but was right. The air was cooling toward evening, and the sky was the deep orange and purple of a high desert sunset, and the street was mostly empty. From the direction of the saloon there was music, fiddle and something with a lower register, and the sound of it carried clearly in the still air. He heard boots on the boardwalk behind him, and he knew without looking that it was Belle. He had learned her walk in the past 2 weeks, the particular rhythm of it, the weight and purpose. She came and stood beside him, not particularly close, but close enough. She was looking at the street too. The prosecutor says the case is strong, Frank said. I know, he told me the same. A pause. He also offered me a position. Frank turned to look at her. As what? He was somewhat vague about the formal title, something involving document analysis and financial investigation. She was still looking at the street, but there was a slight tension in her expression that told him she was thinking carefully about this. He said the territorial court has been struggling to build cases against organized fraud because most people with the skills to analyze financial records are either working in the private sector or they are the ones committing the fraud. Frank watched her profile against the evening light, the strength of it, the gravity. What did you tell him? I told him I needed to think about it. And what are you thinking? She was quiet for a moment. When she looked at him, it was with those direct eyes that never softened without reason. But there was something in them now that was different from the assessment she had turned on him the first morning in his office. I am thinking that I have spent 18 months working toward this moment, and I am not certain what comes after it. She paused. Thomas and I built the ranch together. I have kept it running because it felt like the right thing to do, but the truth is that it is very quiet there, and the silence has been harder than the work. He understood that. He understood it in a way he could not have explained easily to someone who had not experienced the particular loneliness of continuing after loss. You do not have to decide about the prosecutor's offer tonight, he said. No, she agreed. The music from the saloon shifted to something slower. The first stars were appearing in the east, sharp and bright in the way that high desert stars got in the cooling dark. I owe you something, Frank said. She looked at him. Not the thanks, though that too. I mean an honest thing. He faced her properly. He was not a man who struggled with directness as a rule, but this particular thing was harder to say than he expected. Not because it was embarrassing, but because it mattered more than most things he had said in a long time. When you walked into my office with that ledger, I spent the first 5 minutes looking for the angle. Looking for the reason you had brought me something that could not possibly be as complete as it looked, because in 11 years nobody had ever brought me anything as complete as it looked. She waited. There was not an angle, he said. You were just right. And you had done in 6 days what I had failed to do in 5, and I want you to know that I understand what that means. Not just for the case. For you. For what you had been carrying for 18 months with nobody helping you carry it. The expression that crossed Belle's face was not something she controlled quickly this time. It was complicated and genuine, something moving behind her eyes that was grief and relief, and something else that he was careful not to assume he understood yet. Thank you, she said quietly. They stood together while the sky darkened fully and the stars multiplied, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence had the quality of something that was comfortable rather than empty, the kind of quiet that existed between people who had been through something real together. He walked her to the boarding house where she had been staying during the proceedings, and at the door he took off his hat and held it and said good night, and she said good night, and went inside, and he walked back to the marshal's office feeling like a man who had spent a long time in a dry season and had just smelled rain on the wind. The trial of Harlan Cade took place in Millhaven 6 weeks later, and Belle traveled there to testify formally. Frank made the trip as the arresting officer and lead investigator on the case, and they rode to Millhaven on the same morning with 2 of Frank's deputies, the 4 of them moving through the brown autumn hills in the early light with the kind of quiet purpose that the situation called for. They stayed in separate boarding houses in Millhaven, which was proper, and they ate together at the hotel restaurant in the evenings, because there was always something to discuss about the next day's proceedings, or at least that was what they told themselves. The truth was that dinner with Belle had become one of the things Frank looked forward to most in his days, and the realization of that had settled on him gradually over the weeks since the arrest, the way dawn settled, not with a single moment but with a slow accretion of light. He looked forward to the way she ordered her coffee, straight and strong. He looked forward to the particular way she had of pausing before she made a point, that fraction of a second in which she was checking her reasoning for errors, which was a habit so deeply instilled that she appeared to do it even in ordinary conversation. He looked forward to the moments when something genuinely amused her, and the control she usually maintained over her expression slipped just enough to show the warmth underneath it. He was falling in love with her, and he knew it, and he was trying to be careful about it, because she was not a woman you approached carelessly. She was not a woman you approached with flattery, or with the assumption that company and proximity were enough to build towards something. She was a woman who would need to decide, and decide in full knowledge, and he respected that too much to do anything that might make her feel pressured before she was ready. But he also knew himself well enough to know that he was not going to be able to carry this indefinitely without saying something. The night before the final day of testimony, they were at dinner at the hotel restaurant, and the conversation had moved, as it occasionally did, away from the case and into the territory of personal things. He had told her a little about himself before, in fragments, the way you let things out when you are working closely with someone, and a period of trust has been established. He was from Missouri originally. He had gone west after the war, like a lot of men. He had worked cattle for 3 years before a chance encounter with a particularly honest county sheriff in Colorado had changed the direction of his life. He had been a lawman since he was 28. He was 36 now. She had given him fragments in return. Her family had been from Kentucky. Her father had been a schoolteacher who believed women should be educated to the same standard as men, and had acted on that belief with his 3 daughters in a way that was unusual for the time. She had come west with Thomas after their marriage, following the opportunity that the territory represented. She had loved the openness of it, the landscape, the sense that things were still being built and could be built right if the right people were paying attention. "Do you think you will stay in Harlan?" Frank asked. She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "The ranch is mine. I have a good foreman in Will Tackett who has kept everything running while this has been going on." She paused. "But you asked if I will stay, not whether I have reason to stay. Those are different questions." He looked at her. "I think the answer depends on some things I do not yet know the shape of," she said, and she met his eyes when she said it, and the steadiness of that look was the most unambiguous thing she had said to him that was not about accounting records. His heart did something complicated in his chest. "Belle," he said. "Frank," she said at the same moment. They stopped. He almost laughed. She did laugh, very briefly, a real laugh, not controlled, just honest, and it was one of the most beautiful sounds he had heard in recent memory. "You first," he said. "I was going to say," she said and paused, and he saw her doing the fraction of a second check she always did, except this time it was not logic she was checking. It was something more vulnerable than that I am aware of what has been happening between us, and I am not opposed to it. That is a careful way of saying something I could say more plainly." "Say it more plainly," he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen through every misdirection and every hidden motive and every carefully maintained professional distance he had tried to put between himself and what he felt. "I would like to know you better," she said. "The parts that are not about the case. The parts that are just you." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand and held his, and that was the beginning of it, properly. The verdict came in the next day. Harlan Cade was found guilty on all charges, including the murder of Thomas Aldridge. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in the territorial penitentiary, which given the man's age was effectively a life sentence. His assets were seized pending disposition of fraud claims, which meant the land he had been assembling through his intermediaries reverted to proper ownership, and the railroad eventually negotiated for the aquifer rights through legitimate means with the actual landowners, which was how it should have been from the beginning. Frank and Belle rode back to Harlan the morning after the verdict. The 2 deputies rode ahead, giving them space without being told to, because even deputies notice things if they were paying attention. They rode at a comfortable pace through the autumn hills, the horses breathing in the cool morning air. The scrub oaks along the ridges turned to brown and gold. Frank told her about the war, which he had not told her before, not the battles specifically, but the experience of coming home from it, and finding that home was not the same place he had left, that something had changed in the shape of the world that could not be unchanged. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, the complete attention she gave to things that mattered. She told him about the first year after Thomas died, the nights that were hardest, the way grief had a texture that changed over time, from acute and sharp to something duller and wider that was almost harder to bear because it did not demand attention the same way. It just sat in you. She told him that the investigation had given her something to do with the anger, which was different from processing the grief, and she knew the difference, and she was not confused about it. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was a simple question, but he meant it completely. She thought about it for a long moment, which was not her calculating, but her being honest with herself before being honest with him. "I think I will be," she said. "I think I am beginning to be." She looked at him with the clear morning light on her face. "That is not something I would have said 6 weeks ago." He told her what he had been waiting to tell her for 3 weeks, that he was in love with her. Not the pretty words version of it, but the plain, honest version, that she was the most remarkable person he had met in his adult life, that what he felt was not gratitude or admiration or proximity, but something specific and real, and not dependent on the case or the circumstances, that he intended to be around for a long time if she would permit it, and that he was not in any hurry beyond what was right for her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are not what I expected a marshal to be. Is that a good thing?" "It is the best thing," she said, and nudged her horse closer and reached over and took his hand for a moment before releasing it, and they rode on through the golden morning. The winter in Harlan that year was not as severe as some, though there were 2 storms in December that laid enough snow to keep people close to their fires for several days at a time. Frank made the ride out to the Aldridge ranch twice during those storms when the roads were bad enough that he probably should not have, and Belle made the ride into town twice in the stretches between them. And Will Tackett, the ranch foreman, began developing an extremely diplomatic relationship with reality that involved pretending not to notice the marshal's horse in the yard. They were not careless about propriety because the town was watching and people talked, and Belle had a reputation she had built carefully and did not intend to compromise. But they were not apologetic either. They were 2 adults who had been through something significant together and who had arrived at something genuine on the other side of it, and anyone in Harlan with eyes could see that the widow Aldridge was no longer quite as solitary as she had been, and that Marshal Dawson smiled more than he used to. In January, Frank asked her to marry him. He did it at the ranch, in the study where she kept the large oak desk, because it seemed right to do it there, in the place where she had worked through the night to solve a problem that had defeated everyone else, in the room that was the center of everything she had built and maintained and defended with her extraordinary mind. He did not get down on one knee, which was not his style and he thought was not hers either. He stood across the desk from her and said that he wanted to build a life with her, a real one, not a careful, polite arrangement, but an actual partnership between 2 people who respected each other's strength and wanted to see what they could do together. Belle Aldridge looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that had stared down a conspiracy and dismantled it piece by piece with nothing but a ledger and a gift for seeing what was hidden. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want too." They were married in March, when the spring was just beginning to turn the hills green again, in the small church at the edge of Harlan that had a congregation of about 40 people on a normal Sunday, and was considerably more crowded than that on the morning of the wedding. Clara from the diner made a cake. Will Tackett rode in from the ranch in his good coat looking uncomfortable but genuinely pleased. The territorial prosecutor, Aldous Pierce, sent a letter of congratulation from the capital that was warm enough to suggest he had developed genuine admiration for Belle in the course of the proceedings, which she found amusing. Frank stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and thought that the most useful thing he had ever done in 11 years of law enforcement was to look at the ledger she put in front of him that first morning, and understand that the right response was not to defend his professional ego, but to listen. She wore a deep blue dress the color of the sky just before full dark, and she carried a small bunch of wild sage and early spring flowers that she had gathered herself that morning, and she walked down the aisle with the same calm, purposeful stride she walked everywhere, not performing serenity but actually feeling it. And when she stood beside him and looked at him with those eyes, the rest of the church went quiet in the back of his awareness, and there was just her. They exchanged their vows in clear voices and meant every word of them. And when it was done, Frank kissed his wife with his whole self in it, and the 40 people in the church who had become 60 people, because word had spread, made enough noise to be heard on the main street outside. The spring and summer of their first year of marriage were busy in the way that spring and summer always were in the territory, with cattle and planting and the steady maintenance of a working ranch, and Frank commuting regularly between the Aldridge property and the marshal's office in town, and Belle beginning the work she had agreed to do for the territorial prosecutor's office, which had formalized into something called a financial investigation consultancy. A phrase that meant nothing to most people in Harlan, but which in practice meant that Belle received files from the territorial court and analyzed them from her desk at the ranch, and sent back reports that Aldous Pierce described to his colleagues as the most analytically rigorous documents his office received. She found the work satisfying, which surprised her slightly, because she had expected to miss the open-ended nature of the investigation she had conducted into Cade's operations. What she discovered instead was that the work connected her to something larger than her own circumstances, a broad pattern of territorial justice that she cared about genuinely, and that the specific skill she had was rare enough to matter, which was a feeling she found she needed more than she had known. Frank gave her what he promised, which was a partnership. He did not condescend. He did not suggest that her work was a hobby or an indulgence or something that should come second to domestic concerns. He recognized her skill with a frankness that was one of the things she had come to love most about him. When she explained her work to him, he listened with the same thoroughness he brought to his own investigations, and occasionally made connections or observations that were useful. And on the evenings when the work was done and the accounts were balanced and the ranch was settled for the night, they sat together on the porch in the cooling dark and talked about everything and nothing, the stars overhead and the sound of the land around them, and those were the hours that Belle had not known she needed until she had them. By late summer, she knew she was pregnant. She told Frank on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch in the same chairs they always used, the hills going gold in the late light. She said it directly, because that was how she said everything, and watched his face change in the way she had learned it changed when something genuinely moved him. The slight widening of his eyes, the stillness, and then the smile that started slow and went wide. He reached over and took her hand and held it and said nothing for a long moment, just looked at her and then looked at the hills and then looked back at her, and his expression was something she would keep for the rest of her life. "A boy," he said finally. "I have a feeling it will be a boy." "You have no basis for that assessment," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I have a feeling." He was right. Their son was born in the early spring of the following year, a solid and loud arrival that Will Tackett heard from the barn, and that brought Clara from town with food and practical help that Belle accepted gratefully, and without the self-consciousness she might have expected to feel. She had not expected the community that had assembled itself around her life over the past year, the small, warm network of people who had become something like family, but she found that she was glad of it. They named the boy James Thomas Dawson, James for Frank's father, whom he had not spoken of often but with a quiet reverence that told her it was important to him. Thomas for the man who had come before, because Belle had loved Thomas honestly and his death had been unjust, and his son deserved to know, when he was old enough, that his namesake had been a good man. Frank held James on the evening after his birth with the expression of a man who has been surprised by the depth of something. He sat in the chair beside the window with the baby against his chest and looked down at him with a concentration that reminded Belle of the way he looked at evidence when he was building the shape of something in his mind, as if he were trying to understand the full reality of what he was holding. "He is very small," Frank said, in a tone of mild alarm. "He is exactly the appropriate size," Belle said from the bed. "He will be considerably larger in 6 months. That is how it works." "I know that is how it works," Frank said with dignity. "I am making an observation." Belle looked at her husband and her son and felt the particular quality of that moment settle into her. The rightness of it, the wholeness, the sense that the long, difficult years had led here, to this specific light, this man and this child, the wide country outside the window, her own life with its strength intact and the grief resolved into something that had become part of her without diminishing her. She had built this. With her own hands and her own mind, in her own way, on her own terms. And she had let this man stand beside her while she built it, which was different from letting someone build it for her, and she was glad she knew the difference. 2 years after James came a second boy, whom they named Caleb, and Caleb was louder than James had been and slept less and demanded constant motion. And Frank carried him on long walks through the property in the evenings when nothing else would settle him, talking to the baby in a low, steady voice about the land and the sky, and whatever he had done that day, which Belle found so thoroughly endearing that she sometimes stood in the doorway and watched them for a long time before she made her presence known. The ranch grew in those years. Belle's consultation work for the territorial court had gained enough recognition that, by the time Caleb was 3, the territorial legislature had passed a measure creating a formal office of financial investigation, which was the first such office in the territory's history, and the prosecutor's office in Millhaven had asked Belle to serve as its first director. The position was unprecedented, not just in the territory but in most of the western territories, and it generated some controversy, because the year was 1884, and the idea of a woman in a formal governmental authority role was not something everyone was comfortable with. Belle was not particularly interested in the comfort of people who were not comfortable with it. She accepted the position, arranged the work to be done from the ranch for the most part with occasional travel to Millhaven, hired a clerk in the territorial capital to handle the administrative correspondence, and began building the office with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything. Frank, when he was asked about it by people who expected him to be ambivalent, said that he would be a fool to be anything other than proud, and that anyone who questioned the appointment had clearly not seen his wife at work, and that she would do more to establish legitimate governance in this territory than the legislature had managed in the previous decade. He said this without performance or qualification, as a plain statement of fact, and he meant every word. He was still the Marshal of Harlan. He had been offered positions in larger jurisdictions twice in those years and had declined both times, because Harlan was where his life was and he did not want a larger jurisdiction. He wanted this one, the county he knew well enough to understand what was right and what was wrong in it and why. The cases came and went. Some were straightforward, some were not. Occasionally, Belle's work intersected with his in ways that were useful, and they had long since developed the comfortable shorthand of people who thought in compatible registers about problems, able to finish each other's reasoning without stepping on each other's thinking. In the spring when James was 4 and Caleb was 2, Belle came to the porch on a Sunday evening with a quality about her that Frank had learned to recognize as the signal of news being organized for delivery. He waited. "I am expecting again," she said. He smiled, the slow one that started in his eyes. "A girl this time," he said. "You have no basis for that assessment," she said. "I had no basis the last 2 times either," he said, "and I was right both times." "You were right about James." "You said nothing about Caleb." "I said nothing because I was recalibrating," she laughed. It was the full laugh, the uncontrolled one that he had fallen a little deeper in love with every time he heard it over the years. "You are insufferable," she said. "I am a marshal," he said. "We go with our instincts." This time he was wrong. Their third child was a daughter, born in the autumn with a remarkable quantity of dark hair and the same direct eyes that her mother had, and Belle looked at her, and then at Frank with an expression that was serenity and triumph in equal measure. "A girl," Belle said. "A girl," he agreed. He held his daughter with the practiced confidence of a man who had done this twice before and no longer found the smallness alarming. He looked at her for a long time. "Eleanor," he said. They had not discussed names. Belle considered it. "Eleanor Dawson," she said. "My grandmother's name," Frank said quietly. "She was a strong woman. She deserved to be remembered by someone stronger." Belle reached up and put her hand against his jaw and looked at him with everything she felt for him plain in her face, which was how she had learned to be with him over these years, plain and unhidden, because she had understood that being plain and unhidden with the right person was not vulnerability but its opposite. "She will be," Belle said. Harlan Cade served his sentence. He was not a young man when he went to prison, and he was not a particularly healthy one. And the territorial penitentiary did not improve that, and he died in the 7th year of his sentence, which the town of Harlan received with a mixture of responses that ranged from relief to indifference. Belle, when she heard the news, sat with it for a moment and then went back to the account she had been reviewing, because Cade's death resolved the last living thread of what had happened to Thomas, and she had already resolved everything else a long time ago. The town itself changed over those years in the ways that frontier towns changed when the railroad came through, and the population grew, and the rough edges of a new place gradually acquired the character of a real community. A school was built properly, with a full-time teacher who stayed. A doctor established a practice. The boarding houses became a hotel. The Silver Spur was sold and became a legitimate restaurant and meeting hall. The physical evidence of Cade's operations was absorbed back into the ordinary life of the county, the freight office passing to new ownership, the land he had been assembling reverting to its rightful occupants, and eventually selling through legitimate channels, as the railroad development brought value to the corridor he had been trying to control. The aquifer that he had planned to leverage became the water source for 3 new communities along the railroad line, access through fair agreements negotiated by people who did not approach it as an instrument of control. Belle noted this with the quiet satisfaction she reserved for outcomes that were genuinely just. Wooltacket married a woman named Sarah who came to the territory with her brother to homestead, and they built a house on the western edge of the Aldridge property with Frank and Belle's blessing. Their children grew up alongside James and Caleb and Eleanor in the way that children on neighboring properties did, constantly in each other's company in the free-ranging way of frontier childhoods, learning horses and cattle and the land's rhythms before they were 10. James, at 7, showed his mother's gift for numbers in a way that made his teacher write Belle a letter expressing amazement, which Belle received with a composed expression that did not quite conceal her pride. Caleb was his father's son in manner and physical presence, broad-shouldered before he was 6, and with a calm steadiness that already suggested the man he would become. Eleanor was her own person from the beginning, fiercely opinionated and possessed of a sociability that she had not inherited from either parent, at ease with everyone, and belonging fully to no category that either of them could have predicted. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, Frank and Belle sat on the porch in the settling dark. The children were inside, the 3 of them in various states of readiness for bed that had been orchestrated with significant effort by Wooltacket's wife Sarah, who had offered to stay for the evening as an anniversary gift. The hills were blue-black in the last light, and the first stars were out, and the air smelled of the sage that grew along the fence line. Belle had a glass of the wine that Clara occasionally brought out from the cases she ordered from a supplier in Denver, a luxury she had allowed herself on special occasions since the year she and Frank married. Frank had a glass of the same because he had discovered that he liked it better than whiskey, which Belle found quietly hilarious and which she did not tell anyone about because she was not that kind of wife. 10 years, Frank said. I know, she said. I am capable of tracking time. He smiled at the side of her face. What are you thinking about? She considered the question with the honest attention she gave to things that required it. I am thinking about that first morning, she said. In your office. When I put the ledger on your desk. What about it? I was so angry, she said. I had been angry for so long. And I walked into your office expecting to have to fight you, expecting you to dismiss it or patronize me or find a reason to explain why your jurisdiction made my evidence irrelevant. I was prepared for all of it. I know, he said. I could see it in you, the readiness. And you just looked at the ledger, she said. You actually looked at it. That was when I knew you were different. He was quiet for a moment. I was shocked, he said. I have told you that. I was genuinely shocked. I know. I could see that too. She turned to look at him, and in the low light her face was the most familiar face in his world, known in all its expressions and its stillnesses. It was the most honest response anyone had given to my work in a very long time. He reached over and found her hand and held it, the easy comfort of 10 years of holding her hand in the dark. I fell a little bit in love with you in that moment, he said. I did not know it yet, but I did. She turned her hand and held his. So did I, she said, though I would have denied it vigorously at the time. He laughed. She smiled. The stars multiplied above the hills of Harlan, and the sage moved in the light evening wind, and the sound of the children inside was a low, comfortable murmur that was the sound of their life together. The one they had built from a ledger and a mystery, and two people stubborn enough to be honest with each other in a time and place that did not always reward honesty. Belle Aldridge had set out to trace $4,722 across a county-wide conspiracy, and she had done it with such completeness that there was nothing left to find. But the best thing she had found in the doing of it was not in any ledger. It was the man who had looked at her work and understood its worth, and had never since given her any reason to doubt that he understood hers. The night settled in around them, warm and wide, and they stayed on the porch long after they needed to, because there was nowhere they would rather be. Inside the ranch house that Belle had kept and fought for and made into a home on her own terms, the lamp burned warm in the window, and the children slept, and the life they had built together was whole and solid and full of everything that mattered, and it was entirely, completely, and without reservation theirs.